Well, welcome to the 24th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. And may I ask everyone in the public gallery to turn off any electrical devices that may interfere with proceedings. I'll first of all, due to change in committee membership, ask Richard Lyle, who joins the committee, for any declaration of relevant interests he may have. Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. It's good to be back on the committee since I was on it in the last session. Can I refer members to my register of interests, although I would declare I'm a member of Newthill Credit Union, as this committee may look into credit unions at some point.
Thank you. And as a result of John Mason moving from the committee, we require to choose a new deputy convener. Now, Willie Coffey was a substitute member of the committee, now joins the committee as a full member, so welcome you as well. And the Parliament has agreed that the deputy convenership is to be held by a member of the Scottish National Party, and I understand Willie Coffey is the nominee for the post. Do we agree to choose Willie Coffey as the new deputy convener? Thank you. In that event, I'll formally welcome you to the deputy convenership.
Thank you, Convener.
Now, item 3 on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 6, 7 and 8 in private. Are we agreed on that? Thank you. In that case, we will now turn to item 4 on the agenda, which is further consideration of the subordinate legislation, the Debt Arrangement Scheme Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019, which are before the committee in draft form. Today we have Richard Dennis, representing the Accountant in Bankruptcy, Alex Reid, Head of the Policy Department, and Kelly Donohoe, who is Head of Debt Arrangement Scheme and Trust Deeds for the Accountant in Bankruptcy. So I'll first of all invite Richard Dennis to make a brief opening statement to the committee before we move to questions from committee members. Richard Dennis.
Thank you, Convener, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to come and give evidence to the committee this morning. The DAS scheme is something we can all be proud of, and you'll know that the rest of the UK is trying to copy it. But there are 3 main concerns consistently raised with us. First, not nearly enough people benefit from the scheme. Second, it can be confusing for the debtor to know who to turn to between us as the regulator, their money advisor, and their payment distributor. And third, the current fee system means that how long it takes to clear your debts, how much you pay, and how much your creditors receive differs depending on who your money advisor and payment distributor are. These regulations target these issues. They've been in preparation for over 2 years and with 3 public consultations, and all elements have received an overwhelming majority of support in the public consultation that closed earlier this year and in our annual round of stakeholder events held this May. So our first target is to drive up capacity. You might be surprised to learn that Fife and Moray generate far more DAS cases per head than Glasgow. Surprising until you look at the number of advisors offering DAS in these areas. In terms of driving up capacity, you'll have heard last week about the pressures facing the free advice sector, so that any large increase in provision relies, at least to some extent, on expanding the involvement of the fee-charging sector. 1 in 4 of the current DAS caseloads is administered by private firms. That rises to 1 in 3 if you look at cases that have started this year. Those firms charge for their services by a mixture of an upfront fee and a percentage of the monthly payments made by the client. On average, this adds around 15% to the payment towards debt, but sometimes it can be much higher. In one Glasgow case from a couple of months ago, these fees meant the client would be making repayments for an extra 77 months. The draft Regulation 4 removes the right for firms to charge any such fees. In future, clients entering a DAS can focus on the debt payments, no fees and charges from their advisor, alongside the existing protections which stop their creditors adding interest or charges. And this will be the same regardless of whether the advisor comes from the free or the paid sector. Now, removing a source of income is not a good way of encouraging private firms to offer the scheme, unless we take other action. So Regulation 4 also increases the fee within DAS to 20% and brings new opportunities for anyone with the right licenses to deliver payment distribution. That 20% level, which I know the committee questioned last week, is set at a level which matches the current average 15% advisor fee I've spoken about just recently, and the current average payment distribution fee of between 5 and 6%. So what this is doing, it's moving the cost of providing both the advice and the ongoing service from the debtor to the creditor. On an average, looking at the cases from the last 3 months, those entering DAS with a private provider will be debt-free at least 1 year earlier. Regulation 4 also allows for all organisations who wish to be both money advisor and payment distributor, so that most clients will in future have a single point of contact throughout the life of their plan. And finally, Regulation 4 introduces the power for my agency to act as a payment distributor of last resort, to make sure that if one of these providers falls over, there is someone who can step in and look after the client to make sure their plan keeps going. There are other benefits to these changes. We understand that one of the big constraints within the free sector is that it often takes around 6 weeks to get an initial face-to-face appointment. And this must partly explain why clients are still going to private firms and agreeing to pay fees when they could otherwise get the same product for free from their local Citizens Advice Bureau. Clients who currently choose the free sector because they cannot afford upfront fees will now also be able to have the choice of going to other firms because there will no longer be any upfront fees. Providing a level playing field in this way, there's scope to have the free and private sector working together, each doing what they're best at, without the client facing any difference in fees, whichever route they go down. Regulation 4 therefore delivers a single point of contact throughout the payment plan. It tackles fees by making these the same regardless of who the advisor is, and it creates the scope for new players to come into the market. In all, it puts the interest of the person in debt front and centre. It means more people should be able to access debt relief. It means more people will be able to get access to the debt payment arrangement scheme, and it means they will pay off their debts quicker. I can expand on any of these points or answer questions on any of the other issues raised with you last week, but the convener did ask me to keep these opening remarks brief, so I will stop there unless you want me to go on to explain the link between Regulation 4 as I've set it out and the discussion about funding for the free sector, where the witnesses concentrated their evidence last week.
Thank you for that. I mean, we'll probably come on to some of these other issues where you can then expand on those particular issues. You mentioned just towards the end of your remarks there the free advice sector, and currently funding is a key issue for the free money advice sector. Now, these regulations, I understand, were laid before a decision had been taken about how the free sector's contribution to DAS would be funded. So I'm just wondering if you can update us on that issue.
I believe the committee received a letter from the Minister last night, which have all committee members seen that, or would you like me to read the relevant extract?
It may have been circulated and I may not have read the detail if it arrived very late last night. Perhaps you could simply summarise in 2 sentences or even 3 the position set out there if you're familiar with it.
I am familiar with it. I want to make sure I get the Minister's words exactly as he has put them. He says that and I'll just quote the two most relevant sentences. It will not surprise you that the recent consultation produced a divergence of view within the sector, with 1/3 going for an option that would see funds returning directly to those organisations generating DAS cases, and 1/3 going for an option that would see money added to the general funding for debt advice. I have been considering the views expressed, and I propose to allow individual organisations the choice between these 2 options to promote flexibility, ensuring that the arrangements put in place meet the requirements of each individual organisation by placing that decision in their hands.
And, what is your view of that? Will that assist the free money advice sector? Will that work?
I think it certainly will work. The committee may not be aware that under the current DAS regulations, no funding goes to the free advice sector, specifically for DAS related to the cases they generate. I want to underline that we're talking here about very small amounts of money. So our estimates suggest that we might be talking less than £100,000 in the first year. This is not going to make a sea change in the provision of free advice for DAS. But it is a recognition, I think, of all the extremely valuable work advisors do in this area, and it's a first kind of step in the water to see if this type of approach can deliver real benefits.
So you think it's hopefully a resolution at this stage, but not necessarily the final solution to the issue?
In terms of resolution of funding for the free sector as a whole, I don't think there is anything we can do through looking at formal debt statutory repayment tools to deal with funding of the free sector more generally. Now, that's because, as every committee member will know, the hot topic in money advice is actually universal credit. You know, if you go, most people coming to talk to a money advisor will be having problems with the benefit system. Now, I don't want to undermine the importance of what we're doing for the debt arrangement scheme and the very valuable work that money and debt advisors do in putting clients into statutory solutions, but that is a very small part of their remit. You'll also know that, and again the Minister does refer to it in his letter, that there is part of the Scottish Government now focused on delivering debt policy, and they'll shortly be publishing a route map looking at the funding for debt advice across Scotland as part of the devolution of new powers that has brought part of the FCA levy funding to Scotland for the first time.
And may I ask, Alan McIntosh, who you'll be familiar with, has put in submissions to the committee, and I think one of his submissions relates to the idea of having a certain percentage of all funds returned to creditors through statutory debt solutions being used as a source of funding for the Free Money Advice Centre. Is that a solution that you think might work, or why is the solution as it is better or worse, or perhaps of equal validity?
I'm thinking in reality most of that is a question for ministers rather than us as the administrators of statutory debt products. Mm-hmm. If I might make a few comments on that. I suspect the committee are aware of the fair share funding model which underpins charities like Step Change and Pay Plan, I think. And what we're doing in DAS is looking something close to, for the first time, experimenting with a statutory form of fair share. So you could see this as a toe in the water of going down that route. I've said before, most money advice is not to do with statutory debt solutions, and therefore the generic question of the funding for money advice probably can't be coming from this sector. The committee probably is also aware that most bankruptcies produce no dividend whatsoever, and the average return to creditors from trust deeds is well under 20%. Now, creditors also pay towards the FCA levy that's entirely for the funding of money advice. So I think there are quite a lot of issues that we need working through and consulting on before we could go any further down this route.
All right, I'll now turn to Willie Coffey for further questions.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you, Mr. Dennis. You said, I think, in your opening remarks that there was widespread, well, there was consultation on the proposals contained within, you know, and you mentioned Regulation 4 in particular, but our witnesses last week at the committee were all saying they were calling for a wholesale review of debt management and debt relief options and so on. Is their call for that review consistent with the proposals that are in Regulation 4 that you outlined a wee while ago to the committee?
Firstly, I don't think there's any conflicts between the regulations in front of the committee now and the call for a general review of statutory debt solutions. I'm going to quote the Minister's letter again, as you might expect, because I need to make sure I stay in line with what the Minister has said with this. The Minister says, under Section 4 of that letter, I agree there is a case for a more fundamental and wide-ranging review. I will revert back to you in due course with more detail on how that can be taken forward, and I'll be very happy to discuss that further with the committee next week.
I mean, you mentioned things like the proposals in Regulation 4 about having a single point of contact, you know, tackling the fees, the possibility of paying a year early. So they must have got general approval during the consultation. So why would folks still be calling for a full and a whole-scale review, do you think, if that's on the table?
Could I just ask for a clarification if you're asking a general review of Regulation 4 or a general review of the debt solutions?
I think it's a general review of debt solutions, really, just big picture.
in terms of the general review of debt solutions, that's going to take time. These regulations in front of you now will bring immediate benefits to a large number of debtors. They will be debt-free quicker, more people will have access to the scheme. Any wider review is going to take time and almost certainly will require primary legislation to implement. That could not be done in the short term. So I don't think there's a conflict between making progress here and making progress on the general debt landscape. And I'm sure the committee will want to talk to me about trustees, etc., even though they're not central to these regulations either in a minute. In terms of, I think the witnesses were very much focused on the bit of Regulation 4 that deals with funding of the free advice sector. And it might help the committee if I try and set out how what I've talked about, Regulation 4, actually does, leads on to this small return of funds to the free sector. And I'd be happy to try and do that if that would help.
Yeah, I'm sure it would help us.
Because I thought that was one of the questions, so I actually prepared the answer to this one. I've talked about how Regulation 4 makes it more attractive for firms and big charities to deliver DAS. This is largely because we're bringing together the role of money advisor and payment distributor. It's good for the client, they get a single point of contact. Good for private companies currently frozen out of the payment distribution function by the current arrangements, which we can explain in more detail if that would be useful. And attractive for voluntary bodies like Christians Against Poverty, who very much want to take their client the whole way through the journey. They don't want to put somebody in a solution and hand them over to a private firm to do the payment distribution. And the vast majority of DAS cases now, so I've talked about 40% of new cases being private firms, 1 in 3 new DAS cases are done by private firms, 40% are done by step change. So the vast majority will fall into that category now and even greater in the future. And we also think what we've done is create a solution that allows smaller bodies, when they have a client in front of them and they assess that client as being suitable for a DAS, to simply say, go down the road, see my friend, he will deliver this, there'll be no extra fees for you, in a way that they can't do now, because if they pass the client on, the client will face fees. But there will be some smaller bodies, including, I think, bodies like that represented by Mr. McIntosh, who don't want to set up their own payment distribution facilities and don't want to hand over their clients, but they do want to keep offering DAS. And we don't want to freeze them out, because we're all talking about increasing capacity. So we've said in those cases that we will handle the payment distribution on their behalf. Originally, we thought we would just be there as a last resort to pick up cases if a payment distribution fell over. But for these bodies who can't set up payment distribution of their own and don't want to hand them over, we are happy to do it. Downside of that, the client will lose a single point of contact. But the advantage for them is that they will know they're keeping their client entirely in the public sector. So for those, and we've also said that the fees will be the same regardless of who is doing that work. So when I'm acting as payment distributor, I will still be collecting 20%, the same fee for the client, regardless of who's doing it. We're not wanting to make, and that is as far as Regulation 4 goes. Regulation 4 says I have to charge 20% and stops. My agency doesn't want to make a profit, which means we have the opportunity to return the difference between our costs and what we're bringing for that 20% to the free sector. And that's the little element that all the witnesses were focusing on last week. I've said it will be very small. It'll be about £100,000 in the first year, taking the most optimistic estimates. And all that is a very small step towards recognising the valuable work that free advisors are doing. We consulted separately on how to return that, because we wanted to maintain the maximum flexibility. And in reality, we'll have to sort of suck this and see how it actually works in practice. And we want to maintain the scope to do that. I've said for the first 3 years, I'll fix my costs at 5%, and I'll return 15% to give people clear understanding of what's going on. And we've now, the Minister has made the decision that each individual organisation will say, either we want all the money generated from our cases to come back to us ourselves, or we want it to go into the pot for general debt advice funding. And the great benefit for Citizens Advice is they were concerned that people would perceive they had a conflict of interest, so that they might be recommending people into DAS purely so they could get this 15% back. Now they can say, we don't want that 15%. That conflict of interest is, I think, hugely reduced.
Okay, that's really helpful, actually, for me as a new member of the committee to get that level of information. But do you think there's also a case to try to improve the public awareness of what is a very complex area here. Perhaps our witnesses were saying that in one way or another last week, that it's a very complicated area. Sometimes the changes that occur in debt legislation can lead to unforeseen circumstances, development and so on. So providing information clear and simple to the public, is that an issue that's of concern or of interest to us to improve perhaps?
Yes, it is. And I'm sure the point was made to the committee that no doubt on your Facebook feeds, no doubt if you've driven over the Kingston Bridge, you will see large adverts for protected trust deeds. You will struggle to see large adverts for the debt arrangement scheme. No, I don't know. Does anyone in the committee remember our 12 Days of Debt Mass campaign? No surprise that an agency like mine doesn't quite have the advertising budget of some of these firms. So by generating the possibility for them to get active in this sector, we might see that balance readjusted slightly. So I completely agree. We need to do more to promote DAS.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Follow-up from Jackie Bailey.
Yeah, I wonder, just in the interest of clarity, your regulations, and in particular Regulation 4, makes provision for payments to the payment distributors, not directly to the money advisors.
Yes, that's right. Because
Okay,
in most
so-
cases it will be the same organisation and the payment distributor takes the money, so they're the right place to collect the fee.
Sorry, when you say in most cases, it's really only one that we're talking about, Step Change, is it not? And other private providers?
Yes, but
But
that
it's not the free money advice providers aren't really payment distributors, are they?
at present the Citizens Advice Service Network isn't. Bodies
Yep.
like Citizens of Christians Against Poverty will be doing their own payment distribution
Okay.
work.
But it is accurate to say that the majority currently aren't payment distributors.
By number of organisation, yes, not by
Okay.
number of cases. The
Okay.
massive majority of number of cases
Okay.
are done by payment distributors.
But we were taking evidence yesterday from a number of different organisations involved in free advice from the money advice sector. So when you read that statement, the sentence you read out from the Minister's letter, that is a choice for payment distributors who receive the money. It's not a choice that can be directly exercised by money advisors because they aren't the ones receiving the payments. I think you're conflating, my contention is you're conflating two things. You can only get that money, according to Regulation 4, if you're a payment distributor, okay? Some payment distributors provide money advice, like Step Change, and so they can use that money in a way to, fund their own debt advisors, as I would expect they would do. But actually, free money advice sector isn't a payment distributor, and therefore they can't benefit from the sentence you read out in the Minister's letter about having an option, because Regulation 4 doesn't give them the power to actually receive money directly. Is that not correct?
In terms of the Regulation 4 does just set a single fee for payment
Yeah.
distribution. But in the cases you're talking about, either they will have appointed us and we will return the money and we will clearly have our annual accounts audited externally to demonstrate that we're returning that money and that we have only taken an element to cover our costs, or they will come to an arrangement with the firm to hand over those cases. The payment distributor won't get those cases until they come to an arrangement.
Why aren't you adopting the approach that is done down south, which actually recognises that the overwhelming percentage of the fee should go to money advice?
So for other committee members' benefit, you'll be aware that the UK Government is consulting on breathing space, which is two elements, something akin to a statutory moratorium and a statutory debt repayment plan. Their initial proposal is that the funding for the statutory debt repayment plan will be a total of 10%, for which 1% will go to the Insolvency Service for administration, the equivalent of our 2% here. 1% will go to the Insolvency Service, who will do all payment distribution, and 8% will be returned to the money advisor. Now, we have set up a system where we say that we think on average payment distribution is around 5%. And if a private firm can't beat 5%, then the free sector will choose us. So the money advisor will get 15% back, which is significantly higher than 8%. So I'm not quite sure I see where the question is coming from.
There's a recognition, I think, and we heard this from witnesses across the board, that there is a crisis at the moment in the free money advice sector, okay? And it's a crisis that, I mean, we could spend ages discussing the reasons why that's arisen, but it is there, and they see this as very much an opportunity of incentivising the debt arrangement scheme for the private sector, which I understand.
Distributor could get that fee in a way which excluded the money advisor. So I don't accept that the money advisor doesn't have a way in to collect to get this recognition. And in compared with the current system, I hope I've been clear with the committee here. We are not trying to fully meet the costs of the free debt advice sector through this. This is only a small recognition of the work they do. Under the current regulations, they get nothing at all. Is this a step in the right direction? Can we expand on it? It is only meant to be testing the water.
Well, Richard Lyle, I think you also have a brief follow-up.
Yeah, I actually, Mr Dennis worked in the debt collection trade for 30 years, and I welcome the proposals, but I'm getting a bit confused. Can you clarify? Money advice centres, citizen advice bureaus do a lot of this work when people go to them. Are you suggesting that they'll do the work but won't get a fee, and other people, other companies who are presently charging will still get a fee because they'll charge a creditor? Is money advice going to be able to tap into this as a fee side that they can get, quite rightly, that they can get a return on the work that they're doing at this moment in time for free? Yes or no?
Yes.
That's fine.
Do you want me to clarify how?
Yeah, please do so.
You are sitting in a Citizens Advice Bureau, a client comes in front of you. You go through their income and expenditure, you determine that DAS is the right solution for them. You then have three choices. You can ask us to be the payment distributor. If you ask us to be the payment distributor, we will return 15% of the commission direct to you, if that's what you choose. You can reach an agreement with any other payment distributor who might be able to do things more cheaply than us, and you might get a higher return. Or you can simply say, I don't want to deal with the ongoing administration from this case, which will, there's an annual review, there's variations to deal with, there's emergency payment breaks, which are all covered in these regulations and we might mention. I really haven't got the time to deal with that. I need to deal with other clients. So I can pass you on to another organisation at no detriment to yourself. We've identified this is the right solution. Now someone else will run it and you won't pay a single penny for that. In that case, the organisation doing the work will get the fee.
Yeah, so that's the point I wanted to get at. So if the Citizen Advice Bureau passes it on to someone else, they don't get a fee. The someone else gets a fee.
If someone else is doing the work. If the Citizens Advice Bureau is doing the ongoing work, they get the ongoing fee. And
so if they do the ongoing work and pass it to you, they get the fee?
Yes.
Do you not think you're going to take on a lot of work? You, as an organiser, are going to take on a lot of work. It's not easy.
We're entirely confident that we're ready to take on this work. As I say, the large increases in volume we expect will largely be by organisations who will act as a single point for the client and take the client the whole way through. You've talked about the capacity in the free sector. Has the free sector got the capacity to deal with a huge number of more DAS clients? I think that's an open question.
How much is it going to cost for your computer system to do this?
It's already in place. We're putting in a new computer system anyway to deal with the debt arrangement scheme. It's needed because the last one reached the end of its life. The extra cost of the payment distribution functionality of that was around £50,000.
Thank you.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just following up from these previous two questions, you talked about the options that the money advisor has in relationship to payment distribution. I think in respect to the free money sector, the suggestion was that the regulations provide for perhaps a minimum fee from the payment distributor rather than something just purely to be negotiated. And you've talked about these regulations, or this instrument, or at least Regulation 4, is dipping the toe in the water. Is there not some merit in giving a little bit more guarantees of minimum that a free money advisor might expect to receive from a payment distributor rather than leaving it purely to negotiation?
We think we've sort of done that by saying that we will return 15%.
No, you will, yes, no.
Yes.
But the option of going to another party, not yourselves, is subject to negotiation.
Yes.
So the suggestion is that negotiation be constrained somehow by perhaps a guarantee that they get a minimum sum, a minimum percentage fee.
Well,
Or is it effectively what you're suggesting is they don't get a decent deal?
they'll come to us.
They'll come to you. That's effectively...
That's a good backstop. I mean, what we want to do is build as much flexibility as possible into this, rather than try and straitjacket into a particular form, partly because the roles of payment distributor and money advisor are not necessarily as separate as you might think. So you might think a payment distributor is simply managing the monthly payments. What happens if a client misses a payment? The payment distributor gets in touch and says, "You missed your payment, where is it?" But the client has actually had a life shock and needs money advice. Where do they go for that?
Okay, fine. And it's also been raised the prospect that the new regulations may could apply to existing cases as well as new ones. What's your view on that?
I think the first thing I want to say in that is it's quite complicated, and we haven't tested it in consultation. I think it is legally, technically possible. I think there are quite a lot of difficulties we need to overcome. So, for example, the payment distributors with that existing caseload have all been appointed under contractual arrangements with varying fees. Some below 5%, step change take 8%. What happens to those fees? So does step change's 8% get written down to the 5% with 15% going back? Does that push the overall cost of creditors up to 23%? Would those private firms who have cases going with existing CMA fees, which are based on a percentage of a contribution by the debtor, what would happen to those? If those fees suddenly fall and the private firm says, well, we don't want to keep the plan going, what happens to those cases? So I think there are quite a lot of issues, as well as the general point about whether or not you want to do things retrospectively or not.
Could it be made a choice rather than a mandatory thing? So in those cases where it's beneficial to the debtor, they could switch to the new arrangement?
Well, in all the cases handled by the CMA, it would be beneficial to the debtor.
Mm-hmm. So in those cases, they could have the choice?
Theoretically, it could be. Again, what happens if all the debtors who are currently paying ongoing commissions choose to stop paying those commissions? Who looks after those cases? Creditors have all had proposals put to them and have agreed them on one particular basis, which we are now changing. There's a scope for a huge range of variations to come in for these cases. I mean, I think it's technically quite complicated, and it's not something I'd want to get into active consideration until I'd had enough time to consult and understand what those technical difficulties are. But it's theoretically possible.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Last week I was asking free sector organisations about the additional work that's necessary to support clients in choosing a payment distributor, because at the end of the day, it's the client who makes that choice. Do you agree that this will cause considerable extra work?
Perhaps unsurprisingly, no, I don't. And particularly not for the debtor. So, firstly, flexibility and choice for the individual seems to me a good thing. And building in flexibility for the individuals seems to be something we should be wanting to try to take forward. And we have provided a default for AIB to act as payment distributor for other organisations. Looking back in history, an individual had the right to choose their payment distributor up until 2011. That system worked relatively well. We know debtors were very, very heavily dependent on their money advisors for advice on who to choose. And we know when the system first started, money advisors didn't really have much of a feel for who to recommend, but by the time things had gone on and the system had matured, money advisors knew who to pick, they knew who to recommend, and debtors fell in line with that. Worth saying there is absolutely no downside to the debtor, regardless of the choice of payment distributor.
Do you think that the debtor is well equipped to choose one?
No, not without the advice of their money advisor, but then neither is the debtor, or a large number of debtors, well equipped to make the choice between a protected trust deed and a debt arrangement scheme without the advice of their money advisor.
So you would agree that the money advisor would have to give information on the choice of payment distributor sufficient that the client could make that informed decision?
The way I envisage it working is that, so you have our Dennis Money Advice Services. You come to me and I say, would you like to do a DAS with me? If you do a DAS with me, the payment distributor will be the accountant in bankruptcy. If you like the payment distributor to be step change, go down the road, see my friend.
So you're saying that the individual money advisor you anticipate would have a formal link up with one particular distributor, and that the client would then have the choice of going with that or seeking their own option?
Or going to another money advisor. We know this is actually what Citizens Advice Bureau already do with protected trust deeds. Lots of individual bureaus have relationships with a panel of IPs, so that if they have a client who sits in front of them and the right answer is a trust deed, they know who to refer them on to.
But does that provide an adequate choice for the client? I mean, given the fact that the choice is there, who is going to give them the informed analysis of which distribution agent's the right one for them? Well,
their money advisor will fairly quickly come to know whether they have a link up with a good firm or not. And if they have a link with a firm that they don't think particularly highly of, they will change that link.
That seems a remarkably weak explanation, to be honest. I mean, it seems to leave the client either accepting a linked distributor or having to go out and make his or her own decisions.
Well, they won't make their own decisions. They'll go to another money advisor.
So they would go from money advisor to money advisor, seeing who they're linked to, and that doesn't make sense.
Why would the client not accept the choice of the original money advisor? There is no detriment to the client, depending on the choice of payment distributor.
But it's the fact that the client has to be the one to make the decision, and how the client makes that decision, which should be as a result of an informed exchange of information. Now, I agree a lot of clients are probably not in a terribly good position by the time they're at this stage to make that sort of informed decision, which is why the money advisor should be making that the choices available in a simple, easily understood form. Surely that is going to cause extra work. I mean, if we're just saying, oh well, if you go to this particular money advisor, you're going to be dealing with that distributor, and this money advisor, you're going to be dealing with. It's not what the spirit of the law is, or it's not even what the law is.
I mean, all I can say is that this system already effectively works in the trust deed market, where local money advisors cannot deliver a protected trust deed. So at least here the client has the choice of staying with that particular money advisor.
It sounds fairly weak. Also, as far as the payment distributor is concerned, they are not compelled to take on cases. Is there a risk that they would refuse to deal with what they might regard as unprofitable clients, ones that have very little income which they can contribute towards the debt?
Yes, that is. We would expect that to happen, and we would expect those cases to come to us.
So you are the backstop on that.
I was just going to make a point on the issue of payment distribution and the process for selection of payment distribution. I think I'm right in saying that the option to move away from the current procured and contractual arrangements for payment distribution have been pretty well supported. It provides resilience in the system, and it provides for a fallback position. So the support to move away from the current arrangements are there. And moving away for the other arrangements, I think the key has been to try and retain flexibility in terms of the availability of payment distribution services and the firms that can offer those services, as well as providing a fallback position where AIB can undertake those services. Given that the payment distributor works on behalf of the debtor, and given that there's a move away from the existing arrangements to wider arrangements for options for payment distribution, we think that I think the view is that the current arrangements are the most effective parameters that can work within that context.
So if we summarise this, client goes to the money advisor says, yeah, we've got the links with this distributor, that's who we use, take that option or go to another money advisor. If the payment distributor decides it's not an economic case to take on, it then ends up with AIB.
I mean, that depends on the arrangement the advisor has with the payment distributor. We would expect these to be, we would not expect these to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. That would just be hugely bureaucratic. What we would expect is that the individual advisor will have a relationship with the firm and they'll say, we'll take all your cases for payment distribution, the ones we can make a big profit on, the ones we can make no profit on, the ones we can make a loss on. The basket as a whole is what we're taking.
You're making a lot of assumptions as to what the money advisors are going to do. I think it's a good thing if AIB is the backstop on this, but you're not actually saying that. Are you saying, or are you guaranteeing that any cases that other payment distributors won't take on, possibly because they consider them to be uneconomic, unprofitable, that you will take them on?
Absolutely, yes.
Nobody is going to be left swinging in the wind?
Absolutely, yes. We will do payment distribution for any case in which anyone wants us to.
I still think there's weaknesses around and a lot of assumptions around what you've said there, but let me move on. Some witnesses have been concerned about the possibility of conflict of interest with AIB if it takes on the role of payment distributor. And there's other things as well. There's things about developing policy and all the rest of it where there's perceived conflict of interest as well. What would you say to that?
I'd say a number of things. I think the points made to the committee last week were based on a misunderstanding. And actually, the work of the other payment distributors is regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, not by us. So the question of us applying different standards to our own payment distribution work and payment distribution of others doesn't arise. I can see a potential conflict that we might think, yippee, we're making money on our 5%, let's generate lots more DAS cases any way we can, and then we'll get more income. But as I say, we've given a commitment that we will only cover our costs, and that will all be externally audited. And if the committee wants an annual extract of my accounts showing what our costs and what the income we've got on this, I'm very happy to provide it. I would say there's quite a lot of discussion about potential conflict of interest, and I think ICAS might have raised this with you in our role as bankruptcy. In bankruptcy, we are both the trustee in a lot of cases, and we are also the supervisor of other trustees. There are extensive mechanisms in place to handle those conflicts. I'm confident if similar ones arose in DAS, we could put the same arrangements in place.
Can you confirm that you effectively supervise other payment distributors?
As I say, the direct regulation is with the Financial Conduct Authority, but if I can, I will pass over to my colleague Kelly here, who actually oversees the team that checks the work of other payment distributors to set out exactly what we do to keep it under review.
Morning. Yes, we have a current payments distributor panel in place at the moment, and the team have quarterly meetings with the payments distributors. We manage performance, we look at complaints that come in, any correspondence from creditors, so we do have an oversight over the payments distribution process at the moment, but as Richard said, ultimately we would pass any complaints to FCA as the regulatory body of the payments distributors, because FCA give them the permissions to actually do payments distribution, but we do have oversight in terms of performance, making payments. We contact creditors on an ad hoc basis to make sure that payments are being made on time and the correct amount, for example.
Financial conduct really only comes in as if there's complaints and so on. That's really where they click in. In your case, you are effectively supervising, as you say, the day-to-day operations of these organisations. Surely that is a conflict of interest if you're providing the same services, and some people might say competitive services, because there's going to be money advisors who might be doing agreements with yourselves, and you're talking about formalised contracts here. They could be doing agreements with yourselves or other distributors, so you actually have a financial interest in the whole process.
In terms of a financial interest, as Richard said, any monies that are gathered from the payments distribution process for AIB as payments distributor, the money would very visibly and transparently go back to the money advisors who've generated the cases.
That's not the actual point. The point is that you are effectively competing in terms of the other distributors.
I don't think the idea is for AIB to be competing with anyone. We don't want to compete. Again, it's backstop. We would act as a payments distributor if we're appointed to do so by the debtor or the money advisor.
So you would not be seeking to have agreements with money advisors so that you have the exclusive distribution?
No, I mean, I will be extremely happy if no one chose us as payment distributor. We'll maintain the capability, because the capability is largely put in place there. What happens if a big provider falls over and somebody has to pick up the caseload? We came quite close to that situation a few years ago, and it started us thinking, heavens, we need the capacity to be able to step in if we have to. But that's what the capacity is for. Now, if people don't want to come to an arrangement with the payment distributor, and they do want to choose us, that's fine. But I'm entirely confident from my discussions that the sort of 5% we have set will in no way be a sort of competitive barrier and compete others out of the market.
I think there's a lot of grey areas still in there, but I'll leave it at that just now.
Well, thank you. Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Convener. Debt arrangement schemes have been in place since 2004. Why now to make the changes?
As I suspect some of your witnesses might have said last week, we have made fairly regular changes to the debt arrangement scheme since 2004, as we've learned through experience. We've consulted extensively on these. We go out to people and we say, how can we make this better? They come up with a number of ideas. We consult on them. Where we get consensus, and we think we have got a huge amount of support for these, that these would generally make things better for the debtor, then we bring them to you as regulations. So now is because, you know, it's taken us 2.5 years to put this package together. We're now confident it is the right package. We're confident that the debtor will hugely benefit from this, that lots of people will pay less, lots of people will be debt-free more quickly, and that there'll be bigger access to the scheme. So you know, we brought these forward as quickly as we possibly could. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if one of your colleagues then asked me, why have you brought them forward so quickly?
You talked about the fees, and obviously it's increasing from 8% to potentially 20%. And you mentioned the fact that the average advisor fee is roughly about 15%. So does that not skew advice if somebody's going to get a fee from a different scheme that's of a higher than the average, does that not skew the direction of travel or the advice that's given, you know, say concerning DAS over protected trust deeds?
Well, I mean, first of all, the 15% average was largely anecdotal. It was based on the best evidence we had. It wasn't until last October, when the committee very kindly put forward a set of DAS regulations, that we made people declare what their fees actually were. Before that, it was simply a matter between the client and their firm. And very recent indications are that 15% is quite low for an average. So for a large number of cases, we actually think the fees will be lower in future. We're not increasing the fee, we are decreasing the fee. In terms of perverse incentives, a point I should have made very upfront, actually, is the debt arrangement scheme is not for everyone. This is for people in debt, but who have a significant surplus monthly income. The committee might be surprised to find the average monthly payment is over £400. Okay, so the vast majority of people in financial difficulties are not going to be having £400 to spare to deal with their debts. And these are the sort of people where the choice really is between the debt arrangement scheme and protected trust deeds. In a protected trust deed, the average fee taken last year was over 65%. If there was mis-selling, and I think that's a very big if, which I might have things to say about, and you might want to ask me about in a minute, then you would not mis-sell somebody a DAS for 20% if you could mis-sell them a trust deed for 65%. So I don't think there's a significant danger of perverse incentives for the fee charging sector. For the free sector, you know, I've said the return to them might be at most be £100,000. Is that enough to make a difference? They are very effectively regulated through the national standards, etc. And you'll know free sector organisations are not in it for the money. So no, I'm not concerned about the danger of perverse incentives.
And just finally, you mentioned that DAS isn't for everybody, and that the protected trust deeds are sometimes a better way to go, especially as debt's written off after 4 years, not 12 under DAS. You know, again, with the difference in the fee structure, is there a danger that people will be put in a situation where, if they have large debts, and I know that the DAS scheme's aimed at trying to ensure all debts are paid off over a period of time, but is there a danger that people who would probably benefit from a protected trust deed might be pushed down the DAS route?
I think the big difference is that a protected trust deed is sequestration, it's insolvency. So it's in the same market as bankruptcy, whereas DAS is not. DAS is a debt management scheme, not a debt relief scheme. Do I think there's any danger people will be pushed into a DAS? Well, I mean, it's debtor's choice, really.
I guess my view on this is that that nothing cuts across the basic principle that following some advice, people should go into the correct product that suits their circumstances. And if debt relief is required, and that's the only sustainable solution that's providing a way out of financial difficulty, then clearly that is the route to take. So I guess I don't see this as a question of people being corralled into one solution or another, and there should be regulation in place to try and pick up bad practice where clearly people are in the wrong solution for their circumstances. But I would tend to agree with what Richard said, is that the revision of structures being introduced here to DAS, I think, offer less scope to even create the opportunity for the perverse incentives than perhaps already exist because of the fee structures elsewhere.
Okay, thanks so much.
Richard Lyle.
Yes, good morning again. As I previously said to you, I worked as the debt collection manager for the Royal Bank of Scotland, Royal Scott Financial Services. Do you really know what you're getting yourself into? Have you, how many staff do you have to take this on board? And have you actually personally visited a collection company?
Yes, we have visited lots of collection companies. Kelly and her team spend a lot of time with the existing payment distributors. We currently carry out very similar functions when we are dealing as trustee in bankruptcy, and also we have returns to make to creditors. How many staff will we need for this? It depends how many cases we are appointed payment distributor for. That won't be a huge number in the first few months of this. We're entirely confident we can build our capacity as the workload picks up here.
Yes, because you actually said a few minutes ago, you actually won't be dealing with clients who are only paying a few pounds a week. You'll be paying, dealing with people who would be paying, like, say, £400 a month. Is that correct?
That's the average payment, yes.
Yeah. So you're not taking on the whole. You're not solving everyone's problem. You're only solving a certain few. You're only solving someone who is at the high end of the market rather than someone at the low end of the market. And can I say, whilst I was a debt collector, I treated every debtor with respect and abhorred what the companies, and I wish you well, and I agree with you, there were companies who were ripping people off left, right and centre in charges, whereas the company I worked for collected the debt and only the debt and didn't charge people charges. And can I pay respect to the Citizen Advice Bureau and various other companies who deal with people with respect and also deal with people to try and help them, whereas these companies who charge charges were ripping people off. So I welcome what you're doing. I wish you well in what you're doing, but I'm highlighting you're only tackling one end of the market. You're not tackling the whole market. So basically what we're doing is not solving everyone's problem. But if there are, can you answer this? If there are people who go to a Citizen Advice Bureau and would like to go into you handled their debt, would you do it, even if they were only paying £20 a week?
For a debt arrangement scheme, yes.
Right, so basically we're saying Citizen Advice Bureaus can deal with people as they do, respectfully and honestly, and sort out their problem, and then they can pass it to you. You can then charge, and I agree with this, you can then charge the creditor, right? And basically then refund money to the Citizen Advice Bureau. So they can get, quite rightly, an income from the work that they've been doing for years for free.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. Though I should say, to enter a debt arrangement scheme, you need to have a reasonable amount of surplus income because you need to be able to repay your debts in full within a reasonable period of time.
Well, when I visited people, I used to say you would take it from the red side. If you pay £5 a week, you're changing it from the red side to the black side. And as I say, if you treat people with respect and sit down and discuss it with them, people realise, we've all at some point been in debt. You're paying a car, it's a debt, but it's not a debt because you're paying it. You're paying a house, it's not a debt because you're paying it. But people do get unfortunately made redundant. People do hit a bad time, and people should be helped at that time. And that was the watchword of what I said to my staff and what I did. So I wish you well in what you're doing. I want to see it work. I want to see people, the people who have been ripping customers off for years, finally stopped. And basically, and now I'll ask the questions I should be asking you. So several witnesses, I wasn't on the committee prior to this, but highlighted the issue of poor practice and protected trust deeds, particularly. As you said, there have been heavy advertising which may not have made it clear the consequences of entering into a PTD. Is there not a risk that these issues will simply be transferred into the DAS sector if the financial incentives for offering DAS are increased?
Firstly, can I echo everything you said before you got to the question? Though, if you were faced with one of your constituents who genuinely only had £5 a month free and large debts, they would almost certainly be better off in bankruptcy. Yeah. One of the advantages of once you enter a debt arrangement scheme and it's been approved, the creditors can no longer apply any extra charges, they can no longer charge any extra interest, so you're only paying the principal. That's how the scheme works. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Could you repeat the actual question for me? Right.
The witnesses highlighted issues of poor practice in the protected trust deeds.
Protected trust deeds.
Do you agree with me that we have to sort that?
I think there are widespread concerns about the way the trust deed market is operating in Scotland. We have been consulting for a number of years, trying to come up with a package to address those issues in a way that would command widespread stakeholder support. I'm more than happy to do a note for the committee on the proposals we put out for consultation and on the summary response, though it is all published on our website. It would be fair to say we have yet to find a way forward that attracts anything like the consensus I would need before I could come to the committee.
Right. Could I ask you one other question, which has always been quite interesting? Debt companies sell debt other companies.
Yes.
Right? Somebody who owes somebody £400, before they know it, they don't owe that company, they owe possibly, you know, and it's like a revolving door. So the £400 goes to another company, but they only pay £200, possibly goes to another company, £100. And people continue to get letters upon letters upon letters. But then you get the offer. If you only pay off £200 for your £400 debt, we'll settle it up. But it still remains on people. What people tend to forget, it still remains on the credit file. So it will still affect them. Even though they've paid off what they believe they've paid off the debt, they still owe, it's still on the credit file as a debt owed. What do you think about that?
If the debt has been settled,
No, they've only partly settled it. So
well,
it's down as a part payment on their credit file.
I mean, this is getting out of the topic before us now. But if the offer has been made, make part settlement, and your debt will be written off, then the debt should be written off in full.
That's all I want to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions from committee members, I'll suspend this part of the meeting to allow changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much for coming in. Well, may I welcome now our second panel of witnesses for today. Item 5 on the agenda, where we move to pre-budget scrutiny. And the witnesses we have with us today, starting from my left-hand side to right. First of all, Dr. Wendy Hansen, who's the team leader at Grant Appraisal Scottish Enterprise. Then Kenny Richmond, who's the head of Insight and Economics at Scottish Enterprise. Lorna Gregson MacLeod, who's the head of Planning and Partnerships at Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And last but not least, Rachel Hunter, who is the Director of Service Delivery for Highlands and Islands Enterprise. So welcome to all four of you, and thank you for coming in today. If I might just start by asking some questions about budget scrutiny and understanding evaluation placed on what you're doing. I think requires some familiarity with quite a number of different concepts, such as gross to net, or the difference between direct, indirect, and induced impacts, and so forth and so on. Forecasting future impacts, so that in itself is possibly fraught with difficulties, trying to look to the future. All of this can be confusing, so people looking at assessment of what you're doing as agencies, I mean, do these things prevent proper scrutiny of what you are doing as organizations?
Can kick off. I don't think it does, because we can use a mix of appraisal evidence, which is kind of looking at what the potential future benefits and impacts could be of activities, and then we mix that with evaluation activity, which looks at what the benefits and impacts have actually been. So by using both approaches, it gives us a good steer on the types of impacts that we're getting from the investments that we're making.
And I think Scottish Enterprise has produced publicly available guidance on evaluation economic impact. And are you aware if other agencies have done so?
Well, the guidance that we've produced, it kind of draws on best practice appraisal and evaluation guidance, for example, produced by the HM Treasury and by the UK government. So it does kind of draw on that, but we've kind of adapted it so it's mostly relevant to the types of activities that Scottish Enterprise and Highlands Enterprise provide. So it's really kind of tailored to the types of activities that we do, but still follows best practice methodologies.
And does it also relate to what the Scottish Government Analytical Unit does?
Indeed, yes. So we look at the same types of indicators, the same types of measures, consider gross and net impacts. And some of the work that we're going to be doing with the Scottish Government's Analytical Unit, looking at how we take forward evaluation approaches in the future, we'll make sure that these methodologies are followed.
Someone else wish to comment on this? Lorna Gregson MacLeod.
Yes, I mean, following on from Kenny's point, I suppose we do a lot of common evaluations using those common methods. We also look beyond Scotland for good practice. The nature of our region, it's very unique in its characteristics. Learning from approaches in other areas is really important to us. We do some cross-border EU project work, looking at approaches to support and how we would evaluate that. So we're currently, for example, doing a female entrepreneurship project called W Power, working with people in Sweden and Ireland and other areas, looking at how we can better evaluate and test what we're doing with female entrepreneurs is the right approach, and how we can measure the benefits from it, because it's a bit broader than just looking at jobs and turnover, etc. It's behaviours and access issues. So we tried to probably lean a bit more heavily on the qualitative evaluation approach in high, just because the nature of the area, lack of statistics and difficulties in getting things like control groups due to our region. But we find a lot of value in doing that qualitative and cross-border work.
And do you think the way you present your evaluation makes it accessible to those who may not have, the level of skill and understanding these sorts of evaluations as some might?
I think that they are very technical. They're technical documents, but all of our evaluations have an executive summary. I think it's very accessible. The language that's used in there is very accessible. It's not very heavy on tables and statistics where it doesn't need to be. It tries to draw out wider community and social benefits, business behaviours. You know, the views of the businesses are very important, and the social enterprises and communities we're dealing with. So I think the executive summary approach, along with the fuller report, makes it more accessible.
All right, I'll turn now to Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Given that the budget and the amount of money that goes to enterprise agencies and the amount of money they give to companies, etc., is sometimes a little bit contentious, and obviously needs to be delivering value for the public pound. Can you give us any examples of where evaluations you've conducted have led to significant changes in the way you deliver grant support to the private sector?
Well, it's a great question. My view is that we should never have to wait for an evaluation to know where the project is delivering at its optimum, because good project management during the life of a project means that we're getting kind of real-time information as we go. So we tend not to see evaluations providing us with I guess, kind of startling or brand new insights that means that we have to make a significant change, because we're kind of going with our management information and our evidence in real time. So evaluation evidence tends to provide kind of indication as where we may want to tweak things, and also gives us evidence of where we're making the biggest impacts. So we do kind of take each of the evaluations that we do tend to have a set of recommendations. We pull together action plans around that, and it tends to be more kind of tweaking around the edges rather than fundamental changes.
I think we've got some examples of that. We always ask in our evaluations for recommendations of how we could flex our approach if need be. That's a very critical part of our evaluation material. Some examples we've had recently in the last 5 years. Our community-led development evaluation is a good one, where the evaluators pinpointed changes that we'd look to our measurement frameworks and what we capture in terms of our data and our measures, and how we should be looking more at a long-term impact assessment, because a lot of that is about communities generating income from assets that take some time to do that. So in terms of the community-led development, there was a lot of key recommendations about how we could improve value for money with where we put our expenditure, and looking more to put it into the assets that can generate income for communities to bring that stability and to build community growth. And we've taken that on board, and we want to do some more work on that to try to tease out that long-term impact model, which we're currently doing as a pilot.
And can I ask a question specifically about the people that undertake these evaluations? I mean, a lot of them are contracted to the private sector. How do you ensure that private contractors are giving you honest, robust evidence, and they're not skewed by their own commercial interests in getting more work from you?
Yeah, well, all the contractors follow the best practice methodologies. In that respect, they're obviously looking at things objectively, we hope. We don't find that contractors are kind of looking at kind of changing the results or changing the evidence to either please ourselves or to please businesses, because quite often, as I say, you know, when we get recommendations back, sometimes they could be slightly challenging, not suggesting dramatic changes, but also because when our contractors are speaking with businesses, we make sure that any evidence is anonymous. So in that respect, businesses feel okay to talk honestly, to provide objective views as well, and that's translated through our contractors. So we're pretty confident that we are getting objective views back from our contractors.
Okay, no other views on that. On your portal, the evaluations online, over the last 15 or so years, the level of evaluations has significantly decreased. Prior to 2010, Scottish Enterprise alone was averaging about 40 a year, and this has now fallen to about 5. And in fact, in 2019, there have been no reports, and just 2 in 2018. Is there any particular reason for that can explain that?
Yeah, well, we're finding that more and more of evaluation evidence is highlighting that businesses benefit from a combination of support. So it's not not just benefiting from one specific programme or one specific project. So we've been moving more and more away from carrying out our contracting evaluations that focus on a specific project and looking at evaluations that look at a bundle of activities. So in recent years, that includes, for example, the evaluation we did of internationalisation support, exporting support, which looked at a whole range of types of projects that companies have been supported through. Perhaps in the past, we'd have evaluated those individual projects, but our evidence shows that it's that combination of support. So our evaluations are looking at evaluating that combination of support more and more. And then we'll do internal process evaluations of individual projects, which looks at management information, etc., to try and get a handle on exactly how the individual projects are operating. But for the large impact studies, it makes no sense to look at them individually, given that it's a more complex support environment for businesses in terms of the types of support they need and how that combination works.
But can you clarify that that's not constraining your scrutiny efforts in relationship to the decisions you make about, for example, regional selective assistance?
Not at all. Well, for example, we have looked at RSA, and we've looked at that evaluating grants as a whole. So we've been doing some evaluation evidence, which is currently ongoing, looking at our grant support as a whole. So that includes RSA, R&D grants, Training Plus grants, etc. So that's an example of why we're looking at it across the piece rather than focusing specifically on evaluation on a specific product. And by marrying that with the management information ongoing that companies are receiving, for example, that gives us a good steer both on the overall impact from that combination and how the individual grants are kind of working in terms of activities, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish budget process is obviously evolving and has been evolving, and this has resulted in a far more outcome-based focus on scrutiny. Have you had to modify your own measurement frameworks to reflect this, and if so, how?
Well, I could cover Scottish Enterprise first. Yeah, so we are making sure that our performance measurement framework links us closely, for example, with the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework. So we have got measures, headline target measures around, for example, jobs, R&D, exports, etc., which all link to the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework. And beneath that, with our kind of own internal management information, again, it's where possible, we link it to the National Performance Framework, which gives us an idea both of the activities and the outputs, as well as those longer-term outcomes. So we have modified our approach, as I say, to link with the National Performance Framework.
How difficult has it been to make that change? Because every time you talk about statistics, it always seems to be enormously difficult to firstly collect them and then collect them in the form that you actually want. So how big a transformation has that been?
It hasn't really been a significant transformation because a lot of the measures that we see in the National Performance Framework, for example, we've been kind of monitoring those for a number of years. So it's not been a significant transformation. The measures that we look at are primarily focused on the drivers of productivity, drivers of creating quality jobs. And I say, you know, those drivers have been known for a number of years, so we've been monitoring those for a number of years. So it's not been a significant change for us.
Similar to how Kenny's outlined, we've always had an alignment with the National Performance Framework, and we're getting some closer alignment between the agencies as a result of the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board work. There's a common performance framework that's under development. It's not resulted in a lot of new measures. There's been some requirement to adjust some measurements in terms of how we collect the data, when we collect it. It's not a huge impact. I think some things that we would like to do as an agency in terms of the social community impact and the inclusive growth model that we want to pursue would require some system changes, but that's going to be woven into our business transformation programme that's underway. So that does require adjustment to both IT collection, and it will take a number of years to come through, but that alignment's there.
You mentioned inclusive growth, and obviously that's a key theme in Scottish Government policies nowadays. How do you actually measure that?
So we have a range of measures individually that we both have as published target measures relating to things like community investments and generating income from assets in communities, average wages, and that was a relatively new measure that's been in place for the last few years. So we have those targets published and we track them. So we track quality of jobs and the salaries. And we also look at where the investment is being made, because we do have a very strong place-based approach. We're not just looking at the numbers, we're looking at where that impact is being felt across our region. We have particular targets for our fragile areas, and the work that we've started, and we'll be working with Scottish Enterprise and the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency that's emerging on developing this pilot to more accurately measure inclusive growth. What we do know is that numbers alone don't tell the full story, and our board is very keen that we try to look at ways of weighting our measures. We know that the relative impact, for example, from 3 jobs in the south of Uist will have a far greater benefit and impact than 3 jobs in the middle of Inverness, and we need to account for that. And so we've been doing a lot of data modelling, and we'll be working to develop that pilot to work out ways of weighting for inclusive growth impact on a range of our measures, but formally probably focusing on jobs first.
Inclusive growth can be a difficult one to evaluate, given the nature of the measures that you're trying to deal with. I mean, things like you mentioned quality of jobs. Do you evaluate that based on salaries, or?
Yeah, that's one mechanism. For example, our business plan target this year is related to jobs that pay at least the real living wage, but we also monitor things like high value jobs, which we define as jobs that pay 20% above the Scottish average wage. We also monitor R&D jobs, for example, which again, higher skilled quality jobs. But also, as Lorna mentioned, we also track for the companies that we work most closely with, the extent to which they follow for example, the Scottish Business Pledge criteria. So that's almost like a proxy for quality jobs, because a quality company who follows, for example, those pledge elements are more likely to offer quality jobs. So you're right, there's no one single measure, I don't think, of what a quality job is or inclusive growth. So we have to look at that basket of measures. And for example, the Scottish Business Pledge elements is a pretty good proxy for that.
I think it's important that statistics are constant across the whole public sector. Would you say that the way that you collect statistics on inclusivity are consistent with what is being done elsewhere in the public sector?
Again, a good question. I would say that with the introduction of the National Performance Framework, which is a number of measures that are proxies for inclusivity, that's going to start to drive different parts of the public sector, at least in Scotland, to follow the same types of measures. I guess the bigger challenge is how we compare what's happening in Scotland to other parts of the UK or other parts of the world where there's still no consistent definition of inclusive growth. So that makes it more of a challenge, but at least with the National Performance Framework, we can start to coalesce around that and have that consistent approach.
I think we should be satisfied if we can just get it consistent across Scotland to start with. But from what you're saying, it sounds like that there's actually different approaches across the public sector. Would that be correct? The National Performance Framework may be starting to pull it together to some extent, but still, when you get down to the base and you're looking at evaluations, is there a difference between what you do and other areas in the public sector are doing?
Well, I'm not aware of what evaluation approaches other parts of the public sector are taking forward in terms of specifically looking at inclusive growth and.
So you've developed your own model.
Yeah, we're working jointly with Highlands and Islands, looking at to at least make sure that the approach that we take is as consistent as possible, and through the analytical units and the enterprise and strategic boards, we'll be looking at making sure that the agencies, so SDS, Funding Council, ourselves, Highlands and Islands and South of Scotland, will be using similar approaches at least.
And while it's commendable that you're developing all this, I would have kind of hoped there would be a uniform approach right across the public sector.
Well, the Scottish Government's been doing some work in terms of developing what they call the Inclusive Growth Diagnostic. That's been led by the Scottish Government, and that also looks at that range of inclusive growth measures that all parts of the public sector can look at, including ourselves. So again, that's kind of that movement towards having that more, I guess, more comprehensive view of inclusive growth. That's,
so are we moving towards not only having the same measurements, but the same methodology in evaluating them?
I would say we've still got some way to go in that, I would say. But we're definitely getting there, and progress is definitely being made.
Okay, thank you.
I should perhaps have said at the start, the sound system operates, so no need to press any buttons, but if any members of the panel want to come in, just indicate by raising your hand. I'll try to bring you in on any of these questions. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wanted to ask you about your annual reports. Obviously, we're in a situation where we would like to be able to verify some of the activity that you highlight in your annual reports. So, for instance, Scottish Enterprise have shown in relation to regional selective assistance that the trend is upwards in terms of number of offers accepted, in terms of planned capital expenditure and number of jobs, etc. But if we take 1 year out of that trend, so say 2016-17, where there was 65 offers accepted, 37.5 million of capital expenditure and 1,600 jobs, how do we as a committee verify that those numbers actually happened subsequently?
Thanks for that question. So there's a verification of what actually happens on a project. During the course of the project, we obviously track and monitor the conditions to do with jobs, capital expenditure, and that goes on all the way through the life of the project. And then a project will enter a conditions period. And the conditions period depends on the type of grant that was awarded. So for job creation grants, we look at a 3-year condition period for, say, SMEs and 5 years for large companies for them to maintain all of those jobs in post for that length of time. For initial investment, those jobs are like 18 months from the final instalment being paid. R&D grants tend to vary on the size of the company. It can be 1 year, 2 year on job conditions, for example. But sticking with the RSA in particular, once we enter that condition monitoring period, then we're still meeting regularly with the company, either via the account management route or just via colleagues in the business gateway or members of the team who go out and assess that the company is still doing what it said it was going to do. It has still maintained those jobs for the period that it said. And the kind of historical evidence we have on RSA to date is that, in fact, that the companies not only create the jobs they say they're going to create and keep them, but there's in general about an extra 10% leverage on top of that of other jobs that are formed on the back of the RSA assistance. So in a way it probably over-delivers against what we predict and forecast at the beginning of the grant and then what happens subsequently. Clearly, if we ran into an issue with a company where they weren't doing what they said, then obviously we could look at the conditions of the contract and we can look at clawing back funding appropriately relative to the amount of jobs they have done compared to what they said they would do. So there's mechanisms of us absolutely being spot on and knowing what the company did. And I think as well the payment profile is a good kind of real-time reckoner for us, because if we're paying out against what we contracted to do, the company is definitely delivering what it said it would do.
I mean, I fully accept that you guys monitor what companies' performance is and claw back where necessary. I also accept that it can take 3 to 5 years for whatever was planned in terms of jobs, capital expenditure is actually delivered. My question is, where can we see that evidence? So if we go back to, say, 2012-13, where you will have said the planned number of jobs is X, the planned capital expenditure is expected to be Y, 5-6 years down the line, where can we see in the annual statements that this is what actually happened, so that, as you say, you get more bang for your buck, if you like, you get 10% more, I think you said. Where do we see that?
Well, I guess that's not information that we publish, but it's information that we can pull together and share with the committee. It's just based on the management information that we've got. So it's not anything that we hide. It's just something we don't publish because we've not really had specific requests for it in the past, I guess. But we can easily share that with the committee.
I mean, you know, if what you're saying is we're delivering 10% more than what we actually expected, surely that should be something you should be shouting about.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good news story. I think because we've never been asked to report on it, you know, while we'll track it internally and we do it individually, project by project, it kind of did strike us then that, you know, as an organisation, it probably would be quite useful to track that statistic on a more global basis for like different grants, different products. But you know, there are many measures we could collect, so we certainly could produce something that would give the committee that confidence.
Okay, thanks very much. In terms of high, within your annual report, you've stated we approve 54.6 million to support 564 new projects, represent a total combined investment of 185 million. You go on to talk about additional 1,000 jobs, etc. How are these figures derived? How do you arrive at these numbers?
So these are captured in terms of that analysis in the annual report at the time that the investment's being made through the economic impact assessment work that we outlined in our submission. And that's the data that goes in at the annual report stage. It's clearly, as you mentioned earlier, it does take some time before the actuals come through. We capture actual data at the end of year 3 for most things. Some things, if it's a distillery, for example, or something that requires a longer stream to come to fruition, we do take a different approach. But the point you've made is one that the Audit Scotland has highlighted. It's a very good point that we do talk about the data in the annual report about what has been approved to be forecast, if you like. And we have committed in this year to, if you like, a holding year to do a bit more analysis and bring in some more of that actual data next year, because I think it is something that is very necessary. And what we tend to do is doing it on a year-by-year basis is not that helpful. We tend to take it in 3 or 5 years. It provides a richer picture and story to tell. So we do that analysis over the 3 to 5 years regularly. We look at the internal regional impact, and we look at the different measures and how they're playing out across different types of investment sectors, scale of business, for example. And we do that type of analysis regularly internally, but we're committed to drawing that into our annual reports next year, definitely.
Okay, thanks very much.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Convener. First question I'd like to explore is going back to the concept of inclusive growth. And the question is, can you really measure it objectively? Because it's not an accounting term, it's not a financial term, it's an outcome that people want to strive towards. But in my mind, it's almost impossible to measure changes in inclusive growth objectively, because it's not an accounting term or a financial term. Would the panel agree with that?
To some extent, I think you're right. As we were talking earlier, there is no kind of single measure of inclusive growth. Inclusive growth to one person may be slightly different to the concept of inclusive growth to another person. But I guess that's why, as we're saying, if we use that kind of basket of measures, and at least we can link, for example, with RSA, we've got the Fair Work First criteria, which we ensure that companies that are receiving RSA grants adopt those criteria. So that's one way to at least get an indication of, for example, the types of jobs that RSA is supporting are good quality. So I think it's looking at that basket of measures gives us a proxy for the type of benefits we're getting and the types of jobs that are being created.
I do agree, it's very challenging, and that's why we're doing this pilot, because there is a gap. Kenny was right to highlight the diagnostic. It's a tool to identify what the challenges an area has, not particularly in terms of then how you measure what you're doing for that area or for a group of people, and that's what we're trying to do with the pilot, is look at the characteristics of the people and the place, and see if we can play that into how we measure our impact. And I think what we're seeing is that there are ways of doing that. It's not scientific, but I think that combining it with other evidence base. For example, we look to our young people's research to tell us whether or not they feel there's been a change in the areas that they live in, and whether or not they want to come back or stay, whether or not the job opportunities that are out there are there, whether or not the academic offering and infrastructure is there. Now, that is exactly the role of HIE, is to impact on that. And so we can measure through both our research we undertake and using this pilot and the basket of measures. If we combine all of these approaches, I think we can get a better story to tell and a better indication of what we're doing and whether or not we're doing it right and in the right places.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say inclusive growth evaluation is challenging, but I suppose, I mean, I lead the 8 area teams across HIE. We've got a very place-based approach. So what inclusive growth does is actually, I suppose, it helps us flex our approach. And I've given an example of a recent investment we made in the island of Fetler, a very small community in Shetland, where we invested in a caravan park, and you would think, well, it's not something that an economic development agency would normally do, but by making that investment, we made the community hall more sustainable, we made the cafe, we made the local heritage centre more sustainable, because more business, so there were more footfall coming through the small community. And it's a very difficult to measure, but what we can see as officers on the ground is the community confidence is boosted, and that confidence helps communities develop more projects going forward. So I do agree, it's a very difficult one to measure, but it certainly has very focused our minds in HIE in terms of how we deliver services on the ground.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to move on to the key performance indicators set by each of the enterprise agencies. Previous evidence in previous sessions has indicated that the KPIs are set internally and monitored internally. Could I ask the panel to explain how the KPIs are set? For example, are they signed off by the Scottish Government? What role does the Scottish Government have in agreeing the KPIs? And do you recognise the concern that if KPIs are set, monitored and measured internally, there's a degree of concern over the transparency of the KPIs?
So we use a range of evidence when we're setting the KPIs. So that's linked to, for example, what we see the pipeline of potential activity in the year ahead would be, what we've achieved in the past, and also what we see in kind of the general wider macroeconomic environment. And also linked to that, what we know our budget is going to be. So there's a mix of criteria we use to set those. We are stretching where we can be. That's why we put it within a range. And those KPIs are agreed by our board. They're shared with the Scottish Government, but they're not they're not signed off by the Scottish Government as such, but they see them and can comment on them if they want to. So I'd say that it's very difficult making a future assessment of what we're going to achieve, but by giving that range, based on a range of criteria, we think they're robust and stretching. And obviously, we publish our year-end results, which gives transparency of how we've obviously progressed against those KPIs.
Okay.
Similar with HIE, yeah.
Yeah. And I think we also would look at in dealing with our sponsorship team in the Scottish Government and liaising obviously with the strategic board, we look at maybe pushing some of the boundaries on targets. For example, this year we did increase our fragile area job target beyond what we thought would normally be achievable, just to try to push investments in those areas. So we will flex it.
We are a demand-led organisation, and we have a good pipeline of commitment on our books, and that's how we generate the measures for the next year. But I think Lorna's right. We obviously, there's certain particular targets that we try to push, particularly jobs in more remote and rural areas.
And you share the targets with the Scottish Government, but does the Scottish Government typically give you detailed feedback or sit down and meet with you and discuss the targets in detail?
In general terms, yes. Colleagues of mine will meet with the Scottish Government's relevant team, and we discuss the targets. And generally, the feedback has been, yep, that's those look okay, and go for it. So we share our targets with the government before we go ahead with publishing our business plan.
Just wanted to explore Scottish Enterprise. You helpfully provided some numbers in Annex A in your written submission. I'm not sure if you've got those numbers in front of you. Just wanted to check some of the trends underlying the numbers. For example, when it comes to clawback of RSA, there was a significant jump in the 2019 numbers. In 2018, it was 2.3 million. In 2019, it is down as £6.7 million of clawback. I just wanted to check what underlying trends were behind those numbers, that significant increase.
Yes, that number struck me as well when I saw it, and it's the recovery of funds from a company that went bust in Dundee, and it basically they are repaying us back £6.3 million. So when you take the 6.3 off, it's actually down at £400,000, and actually it makes it quite a normal year for clawback, quite average.
And does that also explain the other grants where there are other grants provided to that company in Dundee? Is that why other grants clawback?
Clawback as well, yes.
Okay, thank you. And on table 2, there's a drop in RSA grants from 17.1 last year to 12.6 this year, but an increase in other grants from 72 to 102 million this year. Again, just wanted to get some picture of the underlying drivers behind those numbers.
Sorry, which table are you in?
That's table 2 expenditure, RSA expenditure.
If you get that handy. Oops. Bear with me, sorry.
They're basically showing a drop in RSA grants from 17 million last year to 12 million this year.
All right, thanks.
But an increase in other grants from 72 million to 102 million.
Oh, right, okay. So there's been, well, the RSA grants, there's a slight drop there, and I think part of that is due to FDIs. So we've got, oh, sorry, that's expenditure. I do apologise, I was looking at the wrong thing. Expenditure is very fluctuating depending on how the companies are progressing. And clearly an RSA grant, like all the other grants, pay out over a number of years. So what happens is, there's an initial kind of an award announced of so much money to be spent, but then that's only drawn down over 2 or 3 years. So it can be that if we actually, the 12.6 paid out on RSA in 2019 is a reflection of maybe less offers made out maybe 1, 2, 3 years previously, or just a slowdown. In terms of the other grants which have increased, I can speak for, say, the Research and Development grant, which I also look after, and there's been a huge increase in activity in that particular area. More companies bringing forward more projects with greater complexity and ambition, and that has driven up spend, for example, in the R&D area, which would be part of the other grants line.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Jackie Bailey.
Most of my questions have been covered, Convener, but I never resist an opportunity to ask more. The table that isn't here that I can see is actually the decline in the number of jobs, because whilst the RSA line is declining, and that's been highlighted by my colleague Dean Lockhart, actually the number of jobs relative to the money spent is also declining. Is there an explanation from your evaluation of why that is?
From the evaluation, not specifically. Wendy, is anything from?
Again, because the schemes are demand-led, companies will ask for the products and processes to be delivered that meets their ambitions, and if they're not bringing forward as many jobs-related projects, then the number of jobs might skew down the way. And some of the grants that we offer aren't actually jobs-related grants. So, for example, if I draw a comparison to the R&D grant, which isn't a jobs creation grant, But sometimes against that grant, we can create or safeguard thousands of jobs, but in other years, it can just be hundreds of jobs, and it really is bespoke to the actual grant offer that we've been asked to support.
But RSA is linked to jobs, though.
RSA is, but it will depend then on the breakdown of what the companies have applied for, whether there's a skew towards more capital-intensive projects, which don't have maybe so many jobs related to them, or the aid for job creation. I couldn't give you a breakdown today of what's the breakdown between the funding here.
I would be interested in that, because I think there is a trend over time that shows a decline in the number of jobs generated.
Okay.
So I would be interested to know if we understand what the underlying cause is. Is there just a general shift, or is it happenstance? I mean, we don't know.
I guess so I'd be happy to provide some written feedback. I guess what I could say about that is, of course, when the state aid GBR rules changed in 2014, it became very difficult for large companies to apply for RSA funding, and because they couldn't meet the new GBR rules. So in essence, the scheme is now supporting 99% of the time SMEs, who tend to obviously have a lower job count within them. So naturally there'll be a lessening off of the number of jobs being created, because you're relying on the SME base rather than a large company coming and setting something up. There are exceptions, obviously, to that, but that would be the trend that's happened, I would say, which is causing a decline. But happy to provide more evidence on that.
My colleague Colin Beattie got into how do you assess the quality of jobs. Can you just explain the process, how you assess the number of jobs created and the number of jobs safeguarded right at the start of the application? And do you take into account things like payment of the Scottish Living Wage? Is that a requirement before they receive RSA assistance?
So as part of our due diligence on RSA grants, we look at the ask from the company and the return that Scotland is going to get from that. And with the RSA scheme, there will always be an element of jobs in there. So the company will define exactly how many jobs they propose to create and or safeguard as part of the project. And we'll ask for information about that, particularly the safeguarding jobs. There'll be evidence required about, well, can you prove to us that these jobs are genuinely at risk. These jobs are then cast basically in stone into a contract, so that it's something that we can track and monitor throughout. And the grant is paid out on the achievement of the company delivering those new jobs or safeguarding jobs throughout its lifetime. It's also, as you point out, a condition now which came into force from the 1st of April that all the jobs in our large grant schemes will pay the fair living wage if it's a project-related job, and there'll be no zero hours contracts. Contracts allowed within those projects. So these are brought up with the companies right at the beginning. As soon as we get wind of an RSA application, we go out and meet the company at an inquiry meeting, and we make sure they're quite clear about these rules and eligibility criterion. So far, I'm very pleased to say that all the companies have risen to the challenge. I mean, to be fair, 93% of RSA projects were already paying the real living wage before the legislation came in. So now we're really up at the 100%. But no company has been turned away because they weren't paying the real wage, and nobody has withdrawn an application because they can't pay the real living wage. If anything, it's improved the circumstances for the employees of the company.
Very pleased to hear it, given that we were advocating it for a long time. I think Gordon started talking about how much has been clawed back, and that was developed further. I'm wondering whether your evaluation is sensitive enough to pick up problems emerging at companies, or is that really the responsibility of the account manager? So I'm thinking Kayam and Livingston. Would your evaluation have got us to this company is experiencing difficulty, or is actually that something you rely on the account manager to do?
Oh, I think it's something that happens in real time. So an evaluation clearly happens, you can just looking at a kind of a retrospective. So it's the account manager and other team members who are visiting the companies who are largely responsible for understanding the position of a company, but also we can tell from within my team through the grant management process how the project is progressing, because the company will put in claims for the amount of money they've spent, so you can track whether they are meeting their milestones. The accounts are produced by certified accountants who audit the claims for us as they submit them. So there's there's two ways of looking at it. There's the account manager who's going in and regularly talking with the company about what's going on. And then there's also the request from the company to support their claims about how the projects are progressing, which gives us another way of understanding if a company is starting to get into difficulty.
Okay, thank you very much.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I know evaluation doesn't stand alone. You've just been talking about that there, Wendy. But I wanted to ask you about this murky world of econometric analysis that you engage in, without going into the detail of it. How can you be sure that the statistical stuff you do is robust enough for the kind of sample sizes that you're likely to have in Scotland?
Economics and murkiness are quite often brought together as a phrase. Well, I guess when we're looking at evaluation approaches, there's probably two broad methodologies that we're taking. One is where we take, for example, companies that have been supported, and we try and find a control group of companies in the economy that have not been supported. And through economic techniques, we look to see how the performance of those two groups how they performed over time. So we're in the middle of some work at the moment that the Fraser-Valander Institute are doing for us, which is looking at that. That has the benefits of we don't have to go out to survey companies, so we don't have survey fatigue issues with companies. But it has the downsides of to what extent can you really get an adequate control group when you're comparing assisted companies to non-assisted companies. So you can create a control group, for example, based on the size of a company, based on the sector of a company, and these are kind of what you call observable criteria. But there are other criteria within companies that is less observable, it's less easy to get a control group for. So, for example, how good the management skills are, how ambitious the companies are, etc., etc. But that is one methodology that we can take. The other methodology is surveying companies and going out and speaking to companies. That has the benefits of you get a better idea and some real qualitative evidence of what's working. But that has the downsides of if we supported a company a number of years ago, the people who perhaps were there and involved in that project 3 or 4 years ago may not be with the company now. They may not remember exactly what the company was doing at that period of time compared to what it is now. But it is another way to get kind of evidence and feedback from a company on how they think support has been beneficial. So there's no perfect way of doing it, but by using both methodologies, and hopefully they come out with broadly the same types of findings, it gives us a pretty good steer that the findings we are getting are relatively robust. Then if we marry that with kind of what we call kind of the ongoing real-time assessments and information we're getting back about the companies, then those three elements give us a pretty good idea of how well projects are performing.
Okay. How does the evaluation process actually change positively what we may wish to do in future? There's no point, I'm sure you'll agree, in conducting evaluation and always doing the same thing year in, year out. We know we've got record employment levels in Scotland. So when does it become appropriate, or what's the trigger for thinking, well, let's change and adapt, improve, the model, the process that we engage in to try and achieve greater benefits, perhaps in other parts of Scotland that perhaps haven't been reached by some of these activities and interventions?
Yes, I think we draw on a mix of kind of evidence sources around what we're doing and how we may want to tweak those. So whether it's the formal evaluations which give us evidence, whether it's kind of the real-time intelligence that we're getting from our businesses or our partners around what are they picking up in terms of what's working, what are the challenges, what are the potential projects and support that we can put in. So that kind of helps raise raise ideas or raise issues that we may want to want to look at. We also kind of engage with our companies and our customers to get their views on how well is the process working, for example, in terms of supporting companies. Could we do things quicker? Could we do things faster? And that's kind of fed into, for example, the work we're taking forward for the single business portal in Scotland, which would be kind of a one-stop shop for businesses who are looking for advice, etc. So that's kind of based on the feedback that was collected as part of the Enterprise and Skills review, for example. So there's a whole range of sources of evidence that we can draw on to get an idea of how well are we doing, what's the benefits and impacts, and are there things that we need to consider and tweak going forward. And I think it will be the same with Highlands and Islands too.
I mean, I suppose both our organisations were committed to continuous improvement. It's embedded in the way we work, and I suppose from an economic development agency point of view, we always start from the point of development, so we're always looking for new opportunities. But I do agree that we are working closely through the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board to look at how we can improve our services for customers and actually make sure that our clients and customers are at the heart of what we do moving forward, and understand what their needs are, and using digital technology to aid sort of speed, ease and personalisation for our customers. So there are lots of opportunities there to, we are evolving in terms of using sort of customer surveying techniques and focus groups, and also the use of digital technology to improve our services going forward.
Can you give any examples, though, where you've changed the approach that we take? I mean, I'm looking at the table in Annex A that was mentioned earlier, with all those RSA grants and all the kind of sectorial areas that benefited from that. And I'm making a shameless plug, I suppose, for my own constituency in Ayrshire, who might look to the future to get perhaps a greater slice of some of this activity. How do we make that change to say we're doing particularly well in these areas? It's perhaps sustainable and self-sustaining now and in the future. Let's shift our emphasis to perhaps another part of Scotland that might need a bit of assistance. Have you done that, or do we not do that?
So we do have a very strong geographical focus, so we do have a range of measures that look at what's happening across our area, and we do look beyond our area to see whether or not there are other mechanisms that we can learn from to get better impact. So building that into evaluation is really important. I mentioned the female entrepreneurship. It's just one example. We did it with account managed businesses as well when we did that evaluation back in 2015. So it is that breadth of evidence and trying to support different approaches. But the inclusive growth pilot is very important for us to try to show that, because that tool can not just be an evaluation tool, it can be a resource prioritisation tool. If we can get this to work effectively, it will show us a heat map of different types of forms of disadvantage across our area, and therefore we can use that as a tool to prioritise resources more effectively. But the pilot's just started, okay. So I think we definitely have learned from evaluations where sometimes a programme or initiative works better in an area, and sometimes in the community-led development one, for example, that could be the ingredient of a particular person that looked at the role of a local development officer within a community-based organisation, taking on a wider community role and the impact that can have, very much kind of wedded to having a person in a geography, and if they don't have that in a geography, you get lesser impact. So we use the findings to try to move that model and put it somewhere else that needs it. So we definitely learn and reflect very hard after these evaluations come through.
Okay, last question for me, Convener. Several of the members talked about employment levels and so on and workforce, but we know productivity is the key to add real value and add to GDP in Scotland. So how do we use these kinds of programmes and interventions to increase and improve productivity?
Well, I guess, for example, with RSA, one of the focus of RSA is obviously to help companies invest in capital, and we know from a wide range of evidence and research that one of Scotland's challenges around productivity is our low capital investment rate. So by helping companies consider and support them to invest in capital, and the evidence shows that capital investment is a driver of productivity, that should feed through to increased productivity. And it's similar, for example, with our R&D grants. Again, we know that evidence shows that companies that undertake R&D tend to be more productive than those that don't. So our R&D grants support, for example, is also a driver of productivity. So all of our types of support, we look at how do they influence those drivers of productivity, so we can make sure that we're making that link between what we're doing and kind of the productivity impact, which, as you say, is really important for driving quality jobs, increasing wages, etc.
Okay.
I
Okay.
Investment in human capital is very important, particularly in the Highlands and Islands region, where there is such was market failure in terms of provision of high-level leadership and management training. So we invest quite significantly in that area, and we've seen quite companies that have transformed quite considerably their working practices, their processes, the way they do things, just because of that investment in high-level leadership, lean manufacturing, the Scottish Manufacturing Advisory Service, Lean Learning Academy. There's sort of a range of interventions that we can do to support sort of better quality leadership and management within Highlands and Islands firms.
Okay. Thank you.
Because a number of the companies who receive RSA support will also be receiving other types of support. So it's that kind of combination of support, you know, whether it's leadership development, workforce development, exporting support as well. So that combination we find kind of really makes the difference in terms of driving productivity.
Okay. Thank you.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you very much. Apologies to the panel for not being here earlier. I'm sure members from the Highlands and Islands will accept it's always harder to come down from it sometimes. I just wanted to ask, it's the point actually that Willie Coffey mentioned, or follows on from that. You've talked about the kind of local breakdown or the geographic breakdown, and I was wondering how accurate you think your evaluation in terms of return on investment can be for areas like Orkney, Shetland, Murray, particularly when they've got, you know, different priorities. Obviously, you've got Orkney, you've got a limited number of people actually looking for work, and therefore, if you increase business, you've got those pressures. Murray has a low wage economy, so again, a different approach. So I was wondering how accurate your evaluation can be on that.
There's probably 2 points that are relevant there. One, we actually set different targets within the region, so we don't have, you know, we present in our operating plan the regional targets, but in the areas they've all got different targets that reflect their economic context. Therefore, you mentioned Murray and employment, so they may have a focus on particular types of investments and measures, whereas in the Western Isles it might be more in the fragile jobs that the focus is. So the targets are set internally in a different way to reflect the economic circumstance. We do have to have cognizance of that when we're doing economic evaluation. It's very important to recognise, as I said earlier, and it might have been before the member arrived, but I tried to explain where we know that the relative impact of what we're doing can fluctuate quite drastically between our more urban and town centres versus our islands and our remote fragile parts of those islands. And what we're trying to do is have a tool to measure that in a different way. We're not there yet, but the data is building up and the stories building up there to hopefully enhance that pilot but by the end of this financial year, so that we can then build that into evaluation work, because I think it's very important that we have a different way of viewing numbers and they're not viewed in isolation, and that geographical context has to play a key role for us.
And can I ask, I mean, looking at the work that obviously you do, but that there are other agencies such as Economic Development, Departments of Councils, the Business Gateway. How closely do you work with them in terms of that? How helpful can they be in that evaluation, bringing the information back to you? Does co-location and collaboration help with that? And if it does, is co-location a preferred option for yourselves in most cases?
I work in Shetland and I'm co-located with the Economic Development Department of the Council, and I say it's extremely valuable for that close working relationship. But I can say across the area teams in High, then there are very close relationships with Business Gateway, because we mutually have to support each other. They're providing feedstock for the future, and we refer businesses to them too. But also, I suppose there is a legal requirement for us to collaborate under the Community Empowerment Act now that we are a Schedule 1 partner under the Community Empowerment Act. We must facilitate and support community planning with our partners locally, and we take that responsibility very seriously across the area offices, because economic development is not just about supporting investing in particular businesses and communities. It's also about transport infrastructure. It's also about comms infrastructure, and we have to work with other partners to make sure that that infrastructure is in place to support business and community growth.
Sure. I visited Business Gateway Shetland last year, actually, and that was one of the things that came across, that co-location was very important and can be. So do you think those areas where it doesn't happen could be improved if it was brought in across the Highlands and Islands enterprise region?
I think, I mean, if there's the potential and for co-location, I think is a very positive thing. But I would say that where co-location doesn't exist, I don't think it's detrimental to the relationship, but it can certainly, it's probably more efficient to be located in the same premises.
I appreciate it's not always a high decision.
Yeah.
The last question I was just going to ask was regards to inclusive growth, just following up on what Dean Lockhart said. Would it be easier to deliver on and evaluate inclusive growth if there was a single definition?
I think even if there was a single definition, it would be open to interpretation. To be fair, what inclusive growth would feel like and look like in the centre of Glasgow will feel and look a bit differently, and what the priorities those businesses and communities have, and the challenges they're facing, and also the opportunities that land at their door will look and feel differently. I think in Scotland we do understand and share the same concept, and we understand what that is. I think we do have to look at it from a particular organisational or regional perspective for ourselves. It's very important with our social and community remit that we do that.
Yeah, and I'd agree, and I think that's why it's really important having that kind of basket of measures, because as Lorna was saying, inclusive growth can mean slightly different things in different parts of Scotland. And I think having a basket is probably a good way to take it forward.
Thank you.
Richard Lyle.
Good morning. Basically, no one can disagree that Scottish Enterprise, Highland and Islands Enterprise have done a good job. But someone used to say to me, that's now water under the bridge. So what are you going to do tomorrow? I noticed that quite a number of failed applications. Okay, you say it's only 6.5%. But am I correct in saying that these failed applications, are they account managed applications, or are they applications that are not account managed?
Okay, so I'd have to give you that statistic separately because I don't have that to hand. I can tell you that only 50% of RSA awards are account managed, so there's a chance that only 50% of those what we call rejections are account managed. But what else I could say about them is there's quite often a really good reason why something just doesn't progress to the state of getting an award. And it will be on something the company has told us. So I don't think being account manager or not account manager would have an influence or impact on that. They work very closely with the appraisal team in terms of us understanding what it is the company's trying to do. And it's only if the company then supplies information at the application stage that makes them ineligible or they just can't meet the criteria that we'd have to then reject an application.
So total applications have fallen since 2014 from 145 to latest figures 2018 to 83. What are you doing to increase applications? How are you encouraging new applications, new products, new innovations?
So the RSA scheme is strictly bound under the state aid guidance that we use. So there's only so much flexibility that can be made in terms of what we can offer companies. And the downturn was due to the inability of large companies to apply for funding. So that's what really kind of shot the numbers down. So since then, we've worked really hard with our SME community to get them, and to remind everybody that the scheme's open for business, and we still do get applications from large companies, but it's maybe only 1 or 2 a year. So we're relying on our SME base to deliver the RSA measures now. So we work very closely with different agencies and different bodies to get the message that RSA is still open for business. We look to our SMAS communities of practice. We look at Slade, and I go to Slade and present them with results. And they're very good at kind of like then charging the business gateways to then go out and stimulate activity. And we spend a lot of time on the road promoting the schemes. We also do it through the usual electronic mechanisms such as the web, and we tweet, and every time there's an RSA success story or you know, an awards made. We try and get a tweet out there as well to stimulate further activity and get the message being spread. And it is starting to work, because although the number of offers is in decline, the value of the offers is increasing. So the SMEs are bringing to us more complex, interesting awards. And because we get to work with them early on, quite often when we visit a company, they say, well, we're going to do this. And we say, well, have you thought about doing this and maybe some training and other elements that they can weave in? And they say, oh, right, and like, so what's your long-term growth plans? You know, you're just thinking about this one project for the next 2 years. What are you going to be doing in 5 years' time? And kind of getting involved with those sorts of conversations with companies early on is improving their aspirations to bring us bigger projects that then we can deliver on. So while the numbers have arguably decreased, the complexity and the value of those offers is starting to increase because of the groundwork that we're all doing with the companies.
And a question you were asked by Mr. Coffey, basically what I think he was saying was, what slice of the cake can an area get? So is there a regional target, or is there a funding breakdown by constituency be provided, or is that too technical?
No, we can easily draw that. We can provide that by local authority area, for example, as one of the systems. Yeah, so we can easily provide that after the session.
But you also have to remember that some constituencies fall into 2 local authorities.
Yes, I was aware of that when I was preparing for this session and trying to work out where you all sat. So, yeah, I had a list of projects against various people's names, and sometimes the same projects would appear for different people. So, yeah, we'll provide it in the best possible format that we think suits you.
You were prepared for us, some of us saying, where's my share of the cake?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. Willie Coffey again.
Yeah, just on that issue there, for a number of years I've been trying to persuade ISD and others to give us statistics and information relating to our constituencies. We very rarely get that. You get it for local authorities or health boards or this or that, but very rarely on a per constituency basis for the members, and it would be really helpful in any of this particular work to be able to tell the members for their constituencies how they're faring in that area.
Happy to supply that after the meeting.
Possible.
Yep.
Really good. Thank you.
And a quick follow-up from Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Convener. This is following up on the question of demand and the decline in applications. If and when the Scottish National Investment Bank is up and running, there might be significantly more funding available for enterprise development. How does that significant increase in extra funding available match up with perhaps declining demand in the marketplace?
Well, I guess a key differentiator between what we do and what the Scottish Investment Bank will do is that we are a grants-led team. So we're looking at unsecured investments into companies, whereas the SIB team are largely looking at loans being put into companies. And so it's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. And we have challenging conversations with companies whenever they come and ask us for money. You know, is a loan more appropriate than a grant? And it depends on the financial circumstance of the company, whether they can meet the measures of either of the schemes to then provide the right type of financial assistance. So because we have 2 different offerings, I would still see the demand for grants is going to be high, because there are some companies out there who just cannot secure loans for whatever reasons.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. No further questions from committee members. Thank you very much for coming in today. I'll now suspend this part of the session and move into private session.